And especially when you look at the electrification mandates, because you're asking me to electrify the grid, electrify the home. You want me to use an electric stove. You want me to use electric heat. You want me to use electric dryer. You want me to use an EV. So you want me to have a supercharger, but yet you're taking down my base load. So it's like, so let me get this straight. You want me to consume more, but you're sending prices higher because you're not giving me the base load to match my new demand. So supply is coming down as you're forcing demand higher. I mean, I feel like at this point, like even socks have chips in them and can be charged. So it's like everything we live in is connected by Wi-Fi, by something that has a battery attached to it. So we have to be realistic on supply demand economics. And I, to me, in my opinion, that's a 101 set statement that shouldn't be political. It's supply, it's demand. This is the math. Like math doesn't lie, but here we are.
Hello, welcome to the Wiggin Sessions. I'm Addison Wiggin. I'm your host for the day, and I have with me Mark Rossano, who is a veteran Wall Street analyst and an expert in supply chain distribution around the world, which is kind of an appropriate métier while we are dealing with the post-pandemic financial markets. Mark is the CEO and founder of C6 Capital Holdings. And the last time we spoke, we were talking about the impending difficulties that Germany and the rest of Europe are going to face this winter in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the disruption of supply of natural gas to Europe. This week, while we're speaking, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was sabotaged. Nobody knows exactly how or who did it yet, but I think it's a good place for us to start. Mark, welcome to the Wiggin Sessions.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be back on. Thanks for having me. And yeah, it's things just keep getting more and more interesting when you look at infrastructure and all of Europe at this point. So, as you said, both line 1 and 2 were attacked or had leaks, or however you want to describe it. They won't be empty until till Sunday, Monday, and then once they're officially empty, they'll be able to be. We'll be able to get eyes on it and see what happened. Was the explosion inward? Did it come outward? And then that'll kind of indicate if it was something that was detonated from the inside, if there was something that was done from the outside. And just to give you an idea on structure, I mean, this is a 4-inch metal pipe surrounded by 11 inches of cement. So this is not something that a ship can just drag an anchor and see this thing, rupture and have a hole in it. Based on the early estimates, is that it would take years to fix, if not, permanently damaged. Based on when these things are built, there's always remediation that can be done. So I would be hard pressed to say they're officially out of commission, but it's definitely something that if Russia and Ukraine made friends today, it's not something that is going to be online within the next 12 months.
Yeah, maybe let's talk about the importance of both of the pipelines. So they go through the Baltic Sea from the coast of Russia directly to Germany, but they also have stops in Sweden and in Denmark as well. So let's talk like what kind of flow have the Nord Stream pipelines experienced, or how much of the gas that Europe depends on goes through those pipelines?
So it was one of the main thoroughfares, especially the Nord Stream 1, and then 2, it had never come fully online. But when you look at 1, I mean, that was something that was providing anywhere between 15 and 20% of Germany's natural gas. And now they had walked it back ever since over the last, let's call it, since February, if you will. They've been walking that back. They cut it based on the disagreements between how were they going to pay for it. Russia wanted it in rubles. They wanted to pay it in euros, and the back and forth was just based on clearing the banks and making sure that it could settle. And then it was walked back again because Gazprom said that they had to do work on several of the compressors to make sure that the compressors could move and maintain the pressure. And then it looked like somebody just took motor oil and poured it onto a switchboard. And they said, "Oh, look, guys, there's other damage. We have to shut it down permanently at this point because we can't get the pieces." So when you look at the official damage, now there's different ways to think about, if you want to look game theory, why would this happen? So with the act that had occurred, they can push force majeure. So if Gazprom faces any legal action as it comes to the winter, they could say that this is a force majeure event. There's nothing we can do. We're not legally liable. Or it could just be Putin showing, hey, we can strike anywhere at any time, depending on what it is. And then, it would take too much time if we looked at everybody's reasoning to do this, but it's something where there's a lot of reasons why these would be attacked, both legally speaking, geopolitically speaking, and then just also hinders the ability for Putin or someone who might replace Putin to come and use this as a bargaining chip, because now this is officially off the table.
There also has been speculation that the Americans had an interest in sabotage as well. Can you walk me through that line of reasoning?
Sure.
I know our mutual friend Sean Ring has been pretty active in making that case.
Yeah. So my running joke is that the U.S. diver and the Russian diver bunked heads going down, and they just decided to divide and conquer on who would blow up what. So the U.S.'s standpoint would be it would eliminate a sticking point, which has been there when you look at Nord Stream 2, where there was a lot of disagreement. There was a lot of reasoning on why they didn't want to increase the likelihood, or at least the relationship between Russia and Germany. It would also be supportive of U.S. LNG if you look at the LNG capacity coming through, and it would give us more, let's just say, prowess in terms of moving some of the projects that we want, like the regasification facilities in Germany, some of the offshore regasification the FSRUs that we would want in terms of moving this forward. The pushback on that would be, well, it could fracture NATO, because this is something that they may have needed as we go into winter. And at the same time, unless we did it with the full knowing and approval of the region, we could fracture a lot of the Western unity that has come on the back of the invasion. Plus, Sweden, there's also a chance that some of the Nordics might have wanted this, because it just so happens that one of their pipelines just recently turned on. And as that turned on, this one blew up. So it could have been a joint venture between the U.S. and Nordic allies to eliminate this as a means of communication, and using the new Nordic systems to replace it.
But the fact is, we just don't know at this point, right? I mean, where we stand right now, nobody is putting on scuba gear and going down there and checking it out.
Right. Yeah. Just for sheer fear of getting too close and having it rupture into flames. So we have to wait for it to empty out completely. And then it'll be interesting to see so there are pigs which go down and clean the pipelines. There's pig launchers, pig catchers. And this is something where you could have easily put, explosives on it. You would know which direction it exploded in based on which way the metal's bent. Is it bent outwards, facing which direction? And then if it's something where it was done from external, you would see obviously everything would be bent in. So we could get a decent amount of information just by sheer pictures of understanding which direction all of the debris is facing, and which area the holes are pointing.
So the gas that's coming out, that's coming to the surface, that's just, it wasn't flowing through. It was just pressurized for the moment when they would turn the pipeline back on.
Correct. So it's 100 meters deep. So typically there's processes that you go through when you're not actively using one of these facilities. So normally over time, you don't want the natural gas to sit in there, because there's a lot of water in it, and you don't want the water to sit against the steel and then create a degrading situation. But they are pressurized because they're so deep. So normally you would replace it with some sort of fluid or some sort of entity that would maintain the structural integrity while also coating it to make sure that it stayed protected. They hadn't done that just because they had been shuttered for such a short period of time. So normally you want to do it as quickly as possible, but you do have a window of when you would replace the natural gas with something else to ensure the integrity of the pipeline was intact, for both sides, just in case, there was a means to use it or an agreement made over the coming few months.
Just to play the devil's advocate a little bit, is it possible that the pressurization that they put in, like the substance that they put in there to keep the integrity of the pipeline in place, is it possible that the pressure got too great and blew a seam or something?
It is well within the likelihood, if you consider what the Israelis invented to overpressurize the Iranian systems, where you essentially what it does is you tell the sensor to ignore. And what the virus does is the sensor ignores the trip, which would be a release valve, letting the operators know that there is a pressure gradient increasing. And then essentially you just overpressurize the system. So that is 100% a possibility to do it. It would have actually been probably a safer way to do it because you wouldn't have created a fireball, where instead you just overpressurize the system to the point that the system breaks. And typically you would have alarm bells literally lighting up a screen everywhere that is tied to it. But because that didn't happen, at least as far as we know, it easily could have been a virus that overrode the system, allowing the whole pipe to overpressurize to the point of breaking.
Well, and it's certainly coincidence or not coincidental that it happened at this time. It's leading to
the other
to winter, and which is going to be, Northern Europe is tough in winter as it is, and without the gas that they need to heat their homes and heat their water and stuff, it could be a pretty dangerous event that has happened just months before, or even weeks before it starts getting really cold.
No, absolutely. And one of the things that's interesting, because people will point to storage and they'll say, oh, well, look at storage. Storage is fine. And it's, well, you shut down 70% of your fertilizer capacity. You have 40% of your petchem capacity offline, 30% moving to 40% of your refining capacity offline. And the average company has cut consumption of natural gas and electricity by 10%. So it's like, yes, storage is fine, but what was the cost of doing it? And this is in the shoulder season. So now, as you pointed out, once you start kicking on your heat, and if you get some polar vortex cold coming through, you can drain that storage very quickly, and it could become a very problematic situation, because there is no spare LNG cargoes right now that you can just call up in the middle of January and say, hey, do you have an extra? All of that has been spoken for, and it's going to become very difficult to replenish anything if it starts to pull very quickly.
Let's talk about what they're storing. So it's liquid natural gas, and we produce quite a bit in the U.S. and we can ship it over there. Ours doesn't go to Europe by way of pipeline. But what's entailed in storing it, shipping it, storing it? Sure. Can the U.S., for example, replace the capacity that would be lost by the Nord Stream pipelines?
So the short answer is no. We can't replace all of it. There's the ability to replace some of it, and we've been able to do so. So what we do is we liquefy it on the Gulf of Mexico. There's a spot in Maryland where we do so as well, and then we ship it over, and now it gets regasified, and it could either go into a salt dome or some sort of cavern, or it can go into an above ground tank that is either pressurized, compresses it, and or keeps it as LNG, both of which are expensive. So typically you want to put it into a salt cavern. And the UK actually shut down one of theirs as late as, I believe it was 2018, because it had run its natural course and they didn't want to put the money in to maintain it. So when you look at what's happening now, we had our Freeport had an explosion that will be back online by the beginning of November. Then you have Golden Pass, which should be online in another 2 years, and you have Port Arthur that should be online in another 2.5 years. So right now we don't have any real means to increase it exponentially. One of the things that we will see is a rejiggering of the trade cycles. And so let's look at India for an example. So Russia also exports Yamal LNG from that area. Obviously, a lot of that went into the UK. That is no longer going to be accepted. So they have spare cargoes. So they're in negotiations with India to increase LNG shipments to India. Now, India is a big buyer of U.S. LNG. Now, the U.S. contract does not have what's called a destination clause on it. And a destination clause just means that if you buy it from Houston, you have to take it to Mumbai. You can't sell it in between. Without a destination clause, India can take delivery of the gas in the Gulf of Mexico and sell it directly into Europe. So you could get a rejiggering of the supply chain where India and other parts of Asia buy more from Russia and then turn around and sell their contracts that don't have destination clauses attached to it and send it directly into Europe. You could see something similar in Australia and Qatar. Typically, they do have destination clauses, but based on what is happening in the market, they could waive that and allow it to move into Europe. And if you remember last winter, the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal specifically gave preferential treatment to LNG cargoes to ensure that there was movement between, and we could see something like that happen again between the months of, let's call it January to March.
How much of the global market does Europe consume? And I'm asking this question because there's been, especially since February during the invasion, and then what's effectively just a war, ground war now, there's been so much consternation over how Europe's going to fare in the winter. How much of the global market for gas does Europe consume?
So, I mean, depending on size and time, it's anywhere between 15 and 17% of the world's natural gas. But that's just because as a whole, just in general. But if you look at just how they get that gas is where it becomes very difficult, because they were relying so much on Russia, with a large part of that coming through the Eastern Europe and into the market. But when you think about the whole pie of the global market, you may say it's like, oh, well, 17, 20%, like that doesn't seem too much, but no one's going to give up their gas. It's like, well, I have these contracts for a reason. I consume this. I need this. When you look at South Korea, they're already starting to prepare for shortages by enriching their gas, by injecting both propane and ethane to increase the BTU value. Japan has talked about bringing and has started to bring additional nuclear capacity back on to supplement for the cost of LNG cargoes. And then you look at a lot of Central Asia, you're actually starting to see them get priced out of the market again. It's happened back and forth. And now they're going to have to rely more on middle distillates, whether that be low sulfur, very low sulfur diesel, or high sulfur fuel oil, which is something that we've seen in the past. As LNG prices itself out, they end up running towards or consuming something that is a bit dirtier but cheaper.
Let's bring it back home. So I know the electric grid that I get my electricity on, that we're using at this moment, is largely powered by natural gas. And we've seen our prices skyrocket this year, partially because of supply chain issues, but also because of just diverting gas to Europe. Really, we've actually seen an increase in our heating, cooling, because we're using air conditioning, but also we have a hot water heater that's run by gas. We use gas for the stove, so we've seen our prices go up. And to what extent do you think that the sabotage of the pipelines is going to impact Americans? Most of the people that are watching this are Americans who use natural gas in some capacity.
So it's gonna keep things elevated. You've now seen a new shift higher in the price of natural gas, in the infinite wisdom of our politicians. Manchin had pushed for the MVP pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pass, that has now been stripped out of the pipeline of the bill, and that was going to unlock about another 2 BCF a day, or a billion cubic feet a day, coming out of New England. I'm sorry, coming out of the Marcellus or Pennsylvania. So it all depends on where are you located. So realistically, if you're priced off of Henry Hub, which is obviously on the Gulf of Mexico, which is typically the price that is used, you're going to see prices remain elevated. You're going to see 550, 650 on shoulder season. And then as we go into peak demand, you will see movements to 7 and 8. That is going to be fairly sticky because we have a shortage in the market. Like Kinder Morgan came out and said that we're going to need another 20 billion cubic feet of pipeline capacity just to optimize our system and make sure that we don't have these pockets of weakness and strength. Like Waha, which is in Texas, is trading at almost $4 below Henry Hub. Well, how do we get that to market? So you have these weird backdrops. But to your point, in terms of the LNG market's going to be robust. Everybody's going to take their cargoes. They're going to be incentivized to sell as much as they can on the spot market, but we've increased internal demand. So we've increased the demand that the U.S. has. I just, while you were asking the question, I was pulling up the seasonal chart. I mean, we're well below the 5-year average for the amount of gas we have in storage. So if you think about just how insane our weather has gotten in terms of snow bombs and polar vortexes, you can pull 10 days of cover out in 3 days when you have this polar vortex. And then the other issue is a large part of New England still consumes a significant amount of heating oil. And heating oil, based on new regulations, is the same as road diesel. So road diesel and heating oil are going to be competing against each other. And we have the least amount of distillate on the East Coast ever in our history. And that's not going to get any better. So you're looking at prices going up across the board for electricity. And as you said, natural gas for heating, for your stove, if you have a natural gas dryer, you're just going to see your inherent cost of living continue to go up as these prices remain elevated.
You mentioned that Manchin was trying to get the pipeline open to Pennsylvania, to the fields in Pennsylvania. This just kind of raises a question, because I've been trying to understand how green policy works its way into the energy markets. To what extent was that pipeline revoked because of really just politics? This idea that we can run the nation or even the globe by wind and sun. Was that a factor in not allowing that pipeline to go through?
Absolutely. I mean, it was just political. I mean, most of this stuff was already cleared. Everything had already had the right of way. This was purely a political stand. This had nothing to do with the math behind it. There's bottlenecks, there's demand for it. If you think about the safety of moving it, this is the only way you would want it done. And so there's continuous reliance on things that are intermittent at best. There's the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So we have to respect the fact that, geography, topography are going to be very important for how we plan our grid to make sure it's reliable, it's resilient, and it's affordable. And when you look at, having solar in Massachusetts in the middle of winter, you're not on the equator. Your sun intensity, your sun profile is going to be massively different in the winter, in January and February, than it will be in July and August. So you have to account for those things. And we are just creating more and more policy errors that have just been essentially compounding on themselves over the last 30 years, which has left us in a very destabilized, very unreliable setup, just as we're asking companies to reshore or onshore or nearshore, depending on the nomenclature you use, and try to bring some of these companies home. It's like, on what grid, on what stability? You need to create something that is redundant and that is affordable, and we continue to squander those abilities.
How do you see that playing out? Because the green agenda has a lot of money behind it. Last November, almost a year ago, at COP26, $130 trillion was raised in private money to advance green technology, green companies, green agendas. How do you see that playing out? We're talking very specifically about the transport of liquid natural gas to markets that need it. The politics are disassociated from that entirely. Like, we actually need the energy, but then policy gets put in place to prevent the actual carbon burning that we need to do.
Well, it's interesting because when you look at what is being done, I think it was 2003, we consumed 87% of our power and electricity it was 2003, 87% was fossil fuels. And after trillions of dollars, last year it was 82%. So, you're looking at the inability to replace a lot of these systems, and it's because of their reliability, it's because of their energy density. And the biggest problem is energy density, because you need to store it somehow, but batteries are big, they're clunky, they're dangerous. Like in California, there was one of the batteries caught on fire and was spewing toxic smoke into the atmosphere. And it's like, well, if a refiner did that, they'd be fined. Like that's an unplanned release that you are fined for. You have a battery fire that is a chemical fire. Don't you get a fine for that? Because clearly it shouldn't have happened. There should have been means away from it. And then if you look at the underlying supply chain, which connects to Africa, which connects us to China, and when you look at Russia as the poster child of the big bad fossil fuel entity. Well, China is the linchpin for all of the green energy. They, most of the processing for batteries, anywhere between 60 and 80%, depending on which part of the supply chain, occurs in China. They control a lot of the mines that then go back to China for processing. So it's like a frying pan to the fire. So we're gonna be mad at Russia in terms of everything that they're doing and continue to sanction them. But we also don't like what China's doing in terms of their human rights and what they're doing internally, but we're going to rely more on them for our energy needs. It's like, we need to get smart about, we have a ton of natural gas in the US. We have a ton of natural gas liquids. We really need to focus on tapping that and moving it through the system in the most efficient way. Like, just an example, there's no way to get an LNG cargo from Houston to Boston, because there isn't a Jones Act vessel. And a Jones Act vessel is a vessel that was built, manned, and flagged in the US. So that means that if Boston wants a US cargo, it has to go from the US to the Isles of Grain in the UK, get put into a tank, get put back on a boat, and then it can come over to Boston. And then that's not even enough to maintain the pressure of the system. Then they have to take compressed gas in trucks all throughout Pennsylvania, drive them over to injection points along the system, stack them 8 to 12 deep, so that if you have a cold spell and people start pulling that gas out quickly, in order to maintain the pressure, they start lining those trucks up and injecting the gas in order to maintain flow. So you're looking at a very inefficient system that is inefficient purely because policy is standing in the way of, let's call it safety. Would you rather have that LNG moving in a pipe, or that compressed natural gas in a pipe, or would you rather have it in a truck that could get into an accident, that have brake failure, human failure? There's so many errors that can happen versus a stable sunken pipeline that has sensors all over it to ensure that it's safe to transact and to move a flammable substance.
can you dig in a little bit to the Jones Act? I'm kind of confused why. I mean, it sounds like it was like a America First kind of policy that was put in place, but if you could break it down,
Sure.
why? What interest do policymakers? I mean, we know that they don't really consider the unintended consequences of what they pass, but what's the point of the Jones Act? First of all, explain what it is, and then
Sure.
and then try to unpack it for me.
Sure. So the Jones Act was initially brought in the early 1900s when we were looking to build up our Navy post the Civil War. And as we started to try to come into our own, we wanted to support shipbuilding in the U.S. So the Jones Act was a way to protect our Navy, to ensure that there was enough capacity to move equipment around in between different areas. And again, just try to build out our systems. Now, over time, that has gotten perverted away from its initial standing of supporting the maritime community, supporting the shipbuilding within the U.S., and it has been consolidated amongst a handful of now very wealthy families that have purchased these Jones Act vessels. And they're expensive to build because they have to be built in the U.S. They have to be manned by U.S. sailors, and they have to run the U.S. flag. Like if you look at a cruise ship, it's typically actually flagged in the Bahamas, Greece, somewhere in the Caribbean, where it's a little bit lax on some of the rules and regulations. And that's what's needed to move product from one U.S. port to another U.S. port, where you could take any, as you've seen, I'm sure, cruises come into your port. That's because it wasn't coming from a U.S. port, but from an international port. So when you're looking at this, you're creating an artificial stopping point and an artificial bottleneck because you're limiting the amount of ships that can take product from point A to point B within the U.S. So typically they can issue waivers, which is something that that Puerto Rico is asking for right now because they don't have enough diesel following their own hurricane, following Hurricane Ian. So this is something that has been talked about. There is a ton of research that has been done showing the importance of getting rid of it, or at least modifying it, because it is no longer needed to support our military and Navy in the same way it once was in the early 1900s.
Yeah, I was when I'm always writing about the creation of a new department of government or something under the executive branch, it's always pitched as being temporary, and then decades later it's still there and it's grown into some kind of behemoth. It sounds like the Jones Act is a victim of mission creep,
yes,
as much as any other piece of government.
And as you said, the unintended consequences, like whenever you look at policy, they just assume that they're pushing on one string, but that one string is connected to millions of other strings, and some of them slacken, some of them tighten, and there's so many knock-on effects, which is why we've lost sight of the importance of business leaders and understanding the economics and the inherent knock-on effects, because the butterfly effect is real. We've seen it happen in spades, but we still think that we can regulate and do things that we've learned long ago we need the free markets to adjust to.
Yeah, well, in the face of the fact that free markets don't really regulate, or the gas market doesn't operate on free market principles, Jones Act or treaties between countries, or demand that's going up because of the war or whatever, how bad could it get? Like we've been calling it the nightmare winter, because I can't think of anyone that I've talked to that doesn't expect gas prices to shoot up, and also for there to be shortages and rationing in like first world countries. Like people are going to get a kind of slap in the face in a few months here.
Well, and on that topic as well, and Murray of Murray Cole gave a talk in 2017 where he was discussing that in the snow bomb, I think is what they were calling it, of 2014,
yeah.
you had a massive cold spell that lasted for 10 days. And unfortunately, when you have natural gas fired power plants, you have what's called a freeze off, which means that there's always water in the natural gas side. So you have to shut down that facility and shut down those pipelines to protect the infrastructure. So during the peak period of that snow bomb, 87% of power was generated by coal, and the other 13% was generated by nuclear capacity, because all natural gas had been shut down. They had run out of their dual fuel, the ones that had it, and that created, so we were teetering on the point of blackouts or brownouts. Now, when you turn the dial and we're in 2022, some of that nuclear capacity is now shuttered. 30 moving to 40% of the coal facilities that were producing that power have now been dismantled. You do have some natural gas facilities that have been mandated to have what's called dual fuel, which means that if they shutter because of freeze-offs, they have to have 3 days of diesel backup in order to operate, with the idea that as they start to work through the diesel, they would be able to get more from the storage. But now, so that means that if the same thing happens, we don't have coal to back us up, we don't have nuke to back us up, and we have the lowest amount of diesel in history in storage. So if we get something similar like in 2014, which is highly possible, if not this year, then next or the year after, we will see rolling brownouts in the midst of, negative 10-degree weather, negative 20-degree weather, where you don't freeze in a matter of hours. I mean, you're talking about minutes that you can have impacts like that. This is a huge problem, but everyone is acting like this isn't serious, and it is. And everyone likes to look at green. And don't get me wrong, 65 degrees with a 10-mile-per-hour breeze and sunny out, everything's fine. It's the extremes. It's the heat waves when the wind doesn't blow, and it's the extreme cold when the wind is howling to the point you physically can't run this equipment. So you have to rely on fossil fuels. But instead, we're opening ourselves up to this. And let's be fair, in those extremes is where you have loss of life, not in the middle.
Yeah. Well, we got a taste of that when Texas froze over. Was that 3 years ago? I mean,
Yeah,
that was
Uri. Yeah, Uri.
That was a big deal because like the grid wasn't prepared for it, and individuals were not prepared for it. We didn't conceive of the idea that Texas could freeze the way it did. And I'm only bringing that up because a lot of times the unthinkable is the thing that causes the biggest amount of problem. And if we are already aware of like supply chain issues with gas and or the policies that are shutting down coal plants and stuff like that, it just increases the likelihood of an unthinkable event happening. It could happen on the East Coast where most of the population lives.
Right.
It's kind of a scary prospect.
It's unfortunate. Like my friends and I, we normally go on baseball trips every year, and I wasn't able to make it this year to the one in San Francisco, but it was interesting because they had the Giants game had a 45-minute delay, not because of rain, not because of a TV timeout. They didn't have power for 45 minutes. So they had to wait for the interconnect to be set up because they didn't charge their batteries enough. So they had to connect, and they had to wait 45 minutes for the game to start purely because of electricity shortages. And it's like we're in America. You're thinking, oh, America, and I'm waiting and again, not to say that anybody died. This is an example of something so simple as a baseball game. When they were like, we're looking around, it's like, it's pretty out. Like, aren't the solar panels working? Like, I'm so confused on how there isn't enough power. And this is for something simple. Now throw in some egregious weather or some big shift in the polar vortex. Now what? Like it's not just delaying a game and annoying me because I paid for this ticket and I have to wait 45 minutes. This is, how am I powering, the children's hospital? How am I making sure that the food going, that the water going to, Section 8 housing doesn't freeze out because it doesn't, they skimped on insulation. Like, you're going to see real problems. Like, this is not first world problems, but serious loss of life and damage would just, I mean, you brought up Uri in Texas. How many pipes froze? I mean, you had billions of dollars in damage just from water freezing. I mean, there is a huge issue and knock-on effect when you look at just the cost of remediation versus the cost of repair. And it's really important to do the front end of this. You want to make sure you remediate against it. You have redundancies because the repair costs explode.
The Chinese, I bring this up all the time, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but the Chinese have a phrase that every crisis is also an opportunity. We often cover commodities, we cover the energy markets, and we're just interested in ways to invest. If there is a rise in natural gas prices over the winter, and if there's a weather event and it causes some kind of crisis, what is the best way for individual investors to be prepared for that themselves? But also, there has to be opportunities for the companies that would come in and address the crises. Like,
yeah,
where do you put your money when this stuff is happening?
So you put them into LNG facilities. So that's Cheniere, that's new Fortress Energy. You put them into tankers because tanker rates are going to go to the moon. So that's Golar. Then the E&P producers, the guys, the natural gas producers on the E&P front, they're gonna get great pricing. So you want to find guys that have a decent amount of exposure to the front the front month, not grossly hedged out, but also have access to the markets like Southwestern, Range Resources. And it's interesting because it's funny just in terms of mentality of trading. We're in the shoulder season, and just like every other shoulder season, the companies get depressed and people knock them down. And don't get me wrong, the market falling 75 handles doesn't help stock prices, because baby with the bathwater type thing. But that's where you can start positioning yourself well as we start getting into October, as we start to build up, because I mean, Southwestern was a $22 stock when when natural gas was $3.50, and currently it's $6.89. So it's a very different world when you're looking at this. And then we're going to need more pipelines. And again, MVP is an example, but there's places that it's easier to get built. When you look at the South and the Southwest. When you're looking to move some of this product. So that would also provide some opportunity as well. And then I think you're going to get a big wake up call as we get into November and the Democrats lose a lot of their support, especially when you look at, something that was supposed to be a benefit with the MVP has now been ripped out of the bill.
Yeah, I remember too, just in terms of market cycles, when the tech wreck happened back in 2000, 2001, people were rightly afraid of earnings at tech companies, and a lot of money piled into natural gas specifically. Like, a lot of people were like, okay, this tech doesn't work for me anymore, I'm going to buy gas. And people who made that shift made out pretty well. And it just feels like the market environment right now feels very similar to that. You see tech getting pummeled as the price earnings ratios for most tech companies are just ridiculous anyway. And then we have the Fed raising rates, and people are getting worried. And I think we're now 14 days into a sell-off in the broad market. And like you say, a lot of energy companies are getting thrown out with the bathwater. It seems like we're setting up for a very good entry position for commodities in general, but for natural gas specifically, and those companies that are involved in refining and moving it and getting it to where it needs to be.
Well, and you bring up a great point when you look at, the margin compression and the multiple compression. So, is Nvidia a $400 stock or a $150 stock? Like, it's like people are still going to use Nvidia chips, but should it be at 35 times? Should it be at 15 times? And typically when you come into rate rising cycles and you come into this uncertainty, it's much easier to own something that you can touch, you can feel, you can count. And that's where I like, and speaking selfishly in terms of the C6 investments, like we're buying hydroelectric dams. Why? Because we want base load power. We want to own something that's going to run 24/7 and capture that. And it's something that is mismanaged and policy that has been wrong that's opening up these opportunities. So there's always opportunity out there, as you pointed out. And I think as people look for payback periods and things that don't have high burn rates, because when, like, Nvidia is just one, but I mean, how many of these are zombie companies where they just live on issuing new debt? That's a very different world when you have the 10-year going, right around 4%, just recently breaching 4%, mortgage rates going to 7%. And emerging markets, seeing clear over 10 to 20%, depending on the country that you're talking about. So the cost, the hurdle rates are going up, and now it's time to get more strategic, more really hands-on in terms of something that is like a tangential metaverse thing. It's like, what is that worth? Like, but I know that I can count that gas going through that pipeline, getting stored in that tank, getting sold to that guy. And there's money in that. And there's a certain amount of protection against inflation, against deflation, against rates, where I know I'm going to get a certain return. And I think people have gotten very used to lavish, insane returns because of crypto. And as people kind of normalize their portfolios, I think we have to get more strategic and look at things that are going to have healthy returns, but not something so egregious, but is more of a cash flowing entity that will be insulated for, I think, a lot of pain that's going to happen over the next 5-8 years.
You mentioned hydroelectric. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the situation in Lake Mead, where it's down. The water level is down so far that some of the turbines aren't even moving. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that? So I'm just curious, because I've been following that story, and I'm thinking they're just using too much water, so it's not, it's not getting replenished, and they're in a multi-year drought as well.
And it's the biggest issue is, as you said, the population boom. I mean, you're building a population in the middle of a desert, and then you're pulling on it exponentially. But you also have inherent issues when you have pump storage, because as you build the pump storage, you have the river, and that gets dammed up. You create a big lake, but you have sediment buildup. So as the sediment builds up, it then starts to challenge where your intake valves are, and you have to maintain wildlife. And so your ability to move that water gets diminished over time. Then marry in the fact that you built this facility in a period where you actually had almost a decade of unseasonal rain. And what they're seeing now is actually, if you go over the last 150 years, the weather they're seeing now is actually more normal than the weather they actually mapped it out on. So when you look at the growth and the consumption, they used the wrong assumptions because they used a data set that was skewed a bit more wet than what was actually sustainable. So now you're seeing a lot of issues in the Pacific Northwest, in as you talked about, in the South and Lake Mead, where there is a lot of problems that are looking at this. And that's why one of the things we're evaluating is small scale. There's a lot of small scale hydro out there. It's underutilized. It's in areas that are protected from drought. And a lot of it is run a river, which just means that I don't have to worry about a lot of that sediment storage, a lot of that buildup. Instead, it's just going to run straight through. Yes, you have a certain amount of flexibility where we're going to run really hard in the winter when the forest is asleep and all the water is pooling. And then we don't run as hard in July and August. But if you think about renewables, in the winter, when solar doesn't work, I work great because I have a ton of water based on where I'm positioned. And in the summer, where I'm not all that great, Well, the solar is at its peak. So there's ways to balance this. And then as I lived in the Middle East for a time working on short cycle gas turbines, wind, solar, geothermal, and figuring out the right balance, because it's a basket approach. Like I'm not saying that it's only natural gas and it's not only solar. It's a basket approach. We have to look at what is that geography and topography giving me. And if I have great rivers, sure, let's do it. Let's figure this out. If I have flat land that has a lot of sand, not a lot of clay, with high sun exposure, let's build solar. If I'm on a crest that gets 20-mile-an-hour winds constantly, let's build some wind. But we have to be honest with ourselves of where are we building, what are our needs, and what are the natural resources around us.
Yeah, it seems like that's where politics comes in, that we're not honest with ourselves.
Right. Exactly.
Policies are designed to be one size fit all.
Right.
And you can't do that.
It just isn't. And especially when you look at the electrification mandates, because you're asking me to electrify the grid, electrify the home. You want me to use an electric stove. You want me to use electric heat. You want me to use electric dryer. You want me to use an EV.
Yeah.
So you want me to have a supercharger, but yet you're taking down my base load. So it's like, so let me get this straight. You want me to consume more, but you're sending prices higher because you're not giving me the base load to match my new demand. So supply is coming down as you're forcing demand higher. I mean, I feel like at this point, like even socks have chips in them and can be charged. So it's like everything we live in is connected by Wi-Fi, by something that has a battery attached to it. So we have to be realistic on supply demand economics. And I, to me, in my opinion, that's a 101 set statement that shouldn't be political. It's supply, it's demand. This is the math. Like math doesn't lie, but here we are.
All right, Mark, this is interesting, and I'll definitely keep up with you. This is fascinating for me. And as we get into winter, all bets are off, in my opinion. So
Yes.
What's the best way for people to keep up with you if they're not watching you on the Wiggin sessions?
Sure. So I have a YouTube channel, which is the Primary Vision Network, where it's a podcast YouTube channel where we discuss things like this as well. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is @MarkFNY, or my email, which is mrossano at the letter C, the number 6, capitalholdings.com.
All right, great. All right, thanks, Mark. It's always good to talk to you, and we'll talk to you later.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.